Hi, Alvin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing fine.
Good.
Now, you've written three books, historical fiction, I understand.
That's correct.
Now, before we get to those books, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and how you've come to
Sure.
be someone who has written these books?
Sure. I am a retired, and I started writing actually in 2013. But before I go there, let me give you a little bit of my background. I went to Tennessee State University in the 1960s, in the middle of the Civil Rights Act, et cetera. And 60 years later, I became frustrated by the fact that we were still seem to be going through the same battles and having the same issues that we had in the 1960s. So in 2013, I wrote a political piece that I shared with my family and close friends called "The Republican Party Has Declared Class Warfare." And I just did it because I thought it was interesting and people would like that kind of topic. And it was well received by my family. At first, I thought they were just being kind and nice because they're my family, and I didn't wasn't sure it was really that good. So, but I wrote some other pieces on the Tea Party, all politically kind of driven, and I decided that I needed to embellish this a little bit more. And I was going to start to write a story, a book, if you will, about the WhileBlack experience. So I created the WhileBlack Chronicles, which is basically right now it's three historical fiction books that depict life as African Americans in America during different periods of history. So the first book, If Cotton Could Talk, takes place on a Mississippi cotton plantation. The second book covers Reconstruction, that's if the elders could call. And the third book is about the early years of segregation in New Orleans. And eventually I'll have a fourth book and a fifth book covering different eras of American history. So that's kind of how I got started.
Mhm.
So the first book, If Cotton Could Talk, is not a slave book. It's not a story about slaves. It's really a story about the relationships that people formed in order to survive during those days. As I like to tell people, they didn't know they knew they were not going to be slaves forever. They just didn't know when it was going to end. So the story evolves around four main characters: Tucker, Bertha, Jasper, and Sambo, all of whom are fictional characters that I kind of made up as I was writing. Tucker was a slave on a plantation in 1850, and his father, he was a third generation slave. His father was a slave. His grandfather was a slave. His father died picking cotton, forcing the slave owner to say, I need to find a replacement for him. So he goes to an auction accompanied by Jasper, who is his man who's a slave, but doesn't realize he's a slave. He thinks he's part of the family. And they are introduced at the slave auction to Bertha. Bertha is split up from her family. Her father is sold to a slave trader. Her mother is sold to another plantation, and she's left by herself to fend for herself. But she had a secret that no one else knew about except her mother, and that was that she was taught to read, which was a hanging offense in 1850 in Mississippi.
Oh.
So she learned to read, and she used that leverage when she met Tucker to teach him to read. And she taught several of the slaves to read with the knowledge and belief that they were not going to be slaves forever, and reading would help them survive. And that's what they sought out to do. In the meantime, Jasper, who thought he was not a slave, was the nemesis for them. And he had to be dealt with as they started to evolve, and freedom started to look like it was more of a realistic possibility. And then there was Sambo. Now, Sambo was a young boy purchased by a fellow by the name of Big Dan Connor. Big Dan was a ruthless man who was feared by whites and blacks on the Mississippi plantations because of his violence and brutality. So he had Sambo, who was sort of like his pet dog. Everywhere he went, he took Sambo with him. What he didn't realize is that Sambo was also trained by some of the slaves to basically be a spy. So while Big Dan was running around intimidating people, Sambo was taking notes and began to formulate plans to survive and help them survive the next step, which would be freedom. So Sambo has a confrontation after they were free. Sambo has a confrontation with Big Dan, and he wins the fight, but it wasn't over. Sambo goes, picks up his girlfriend, and they leave Mississippi looking for Indian territory as an escape. Big Dan follows them into Indian territory. Make a long story short, Big Dan is never seen again. Sambo survives, and his last comment in the book is that we are done running and we found a home, and he's incorporated into the Indian culture and society. One of the things that I learned in this particular book is that, and I didn't realize this, 75% of the world's cotton came from America. I was astounded by that figure. I knew it was large, but I never realized that 75% of the world's cotton came from America. The second thing that I learned is that people talk about the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves. What they don't talk about is the Emancipation Proclamation only covered slaves who were in the rebellious states. So if you were a slave in upstate New York, you were not free by that. So I thought that was an interesting point of history.
I mean, so after 1865, I guess they all were not slaves anymore, even.
Yeah, no, after the Civil War, they all became free.
Sure. But it's interesting that the Union was fighting against that, and they were also practicing it themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So.
Yeah. So how did you do your research for this book?
Just through reading and Google. I'm not a historian.
Right.
But I like history. I've always liked history. As a matter of fact, I minored in history in school. So I just picked up little tidbits, and you start reading things, and the information's out there. You just have to go search it out.
Yeah. So nothing personal, nothing within your family?
No. I mean, I can share with you that my grandfather tells a story about how they left Louisiana because they thought it was too dangerous for them, and they ended up settling in Arkansas, which was, I guess it was less dangerous, but that's where they ended up settling.
Yeah.
So that was that particular era of freedom. The issue becomes, we were free, but free to do what? Yeah, no exactly. Skills, nothing.
Sure.
So that leads to the next book, which is If the Elders Call. If the Elders Call takes place after the Civil War and during the sharecropping era and Reconstruction. After the Civil War, the slaves had to sign sharecropper contracts, which basically would indebt them for generations. And they had no choice. They could either sign that contract or get off the land and starve to death. So for the most part, they chose the latter. They chose to sign the contracts, which they did. In the process of signing a contract, it's really two stories. Part one of the story is about Reconstruction and how Reconstruction was actually working to the benefit of everybody. But political compromise got in the way. And the compromise of 1877, so that Alvin Hayes could be elected president, he agreed to remove all the troops out of the South for the support of the Southern Democrats, so he could be elected president. Well, once he removed all of the troops out, and then the violence started. But at the same time, my family is pretty courageous and they're pretty smart, and they use their smarts to purchase land. When they were working with the Reconstruction people, they were able to get fair contracts for their work. And what they did, they pooled their resources with other ex-slaves. So they had a bunch of money to buy land with. And they bought the land, but there was a secret that they were trying to do. They bought the land and they convinced the landowner to just throw in what they described as swampland. The swampland was full of timber that the owner never knew was there because he was so focused on picking cotton. Well, they took the timber business and grew it into a viable, strong business in part two. That was the good news. The bad news is that they attracted the attention of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Earl, who was the original family's grandson, decided that he had to sell the business in order to protect himself and to get out of the South. So he sold the business and took on the Ku Klux Klan because the Ku Klux Klan targeted him as a threat. They even went so far as to arrest his cousin for being a vagrant, which was part of the process back then. Was if you didn't have any money, you were walking down the street, the police would arrest you as a vagrant. And some big farm would come along, pay your bail, ship you out to the farm, and you'd never be seen again. Well, they did the same thing to Earl's cousin. They arrested him. He was with his mother. The sheriff and his deputy beat up his mother, took him to jail, and then they bailed him out to a pine farm in North Carolina. Earl gets wind of that and cahoots with a bunch of Black outlaws, gangsters, and pirates. And they recapture Charlie and ship him off to New Orleans. And everyone in the family leaves to New Orleans to get out of Mississippi, except for Earl. Earl is determined to exact revenge on the sheriff and the deputy. So he gets together with the bandits, and they trap the sheriff, and they dispose of him and the deputy, and they're never seen again. And they go to New Orleans to start a new life and start all over again. But their intention is to migrate to Chicago. That's their intention. So that closes out book two. Okay. Book three is If New Orleans Could Talk. There's a theme here with my if, but that's kind of what I do. If New Orleans Could Talk takes them to New Orleans. Everyone is there. And it's really a story about two amazing women who take the leadership to get the family to Chicago. One woman is Linda Thomas, who is Earl's daughter. Earl tells them that he's tired of leading, and he wants one of his kids to lead them to Chicago. He's got two kids. He's got two sons and two daughters. Linda steps up and says, "I'll do this. And I'll work with Betty Jones to help me pull this off." Well, Earl is taken aback by that because Betty Jones is a brothel madam. She operates the biggest brothel in New Orleans called Mahogany Hall. Mahogany Hall was the most lavish brothel in the Gulf Coast. That's a true story. She operates that, and she also had another secret where she was her dreams were like visions. So every time she had a dream, it always came true. So one day she dreamed that she was going to meet some people, and they were going to partner, and she was going to meet some other people, and they were going to be enemies. And all of those things came true. So they decide that they needed to create a business. That's what they do. But the Port of New Orleans was run by two white supremacists who vowed that African Americans would never get a license to start an import-export business as long as they were in charge. So Betty and Linda create this complex plot to dismantle the two men from their positions and force them to grant them a license to create an import-export business. That business is created. The fellow who said he would never grant a license resigns in disgrace. And the backdrop of that is that they were both visitors to Mahogany Hall on a regular basis, not realizing that the ladies there were sharing information about their deepest secrets and how to maneuver with them to get them to step aside and get what they wanted to get done. So they created a scheme that if it backfired, they would probably be killed. But if it was successful, they could start a successful import-export business. They were able to do that. At the same time, our friend Charlie decides that he wants to be a gangster. And he decides to leave the family and start a bloody trail to take over the gangsters and criminals in New Orleans. Well, he was fine until he goes to Mahogany Hall and crosses paths with this fellow named LeBlanc, who was a white supremacist. And the result is that LeBlanc puts out a contract for Charlie. And Charlie is able to, well, without giving away the story, it gets complex. Charlie is threatened. And as a result, Linda has to go see Charlie and revenge his death because he's killed. So that's the other plot. Mm-hmm. And then after building a successful business, Betty Jones sells Mahogany Hall and tells Linda she needs to sell the business because something is coming and you need to be prepared for it. You need to get out of the business. And that's how the story closes. Right. Now, the other thing that was interesting is that I was trying to pick up some information. They started off as sharecroppers. What most people don't realize is that most sharecroppers were white. But the vision, the story goes that most people think they were black, but the reality is 3/4 of them were white. So that was one story. The other story is in the rebellion against Reconstruction was so violent in Mississippi, they had an insurrection. This would sound familiar. They had an insurrection and took over the State House. And Grant refused to send in federal troops to take the State House back. And as a result, all the military support for Reconstruction went away. And as a result, it was one of the most violent periods in American history. So that's where that book kind of ends. They're all in New Orleans, and they are prepared to take the next step to go to Chicago. Between 1916 and 1919, 3 years, 500,000 people migrated from the South just to Chicago, trying to get out of the South. Yeah. 6 million people migrated from the South, East, North, and West between 1916 and about 1917. Right. So the South was not a place for most people to be.
Well, I've been all across the United States as a musician and also as a tourist. I've been to Chicago. I've been to Philadelphia. I guess some of them went to Philadelphia then too.
Yeah, they went to Canada. They went west. They went to the Midwest, and they went to the Northeast. One of the stories in the book is about a lady in this story was told to me by a friend. One of her relatives. They only knew her as Mama Coleman, but Mama Coleman lived in Americus, Georgia, and her and her kids witnessed the hangings of 4 young Black men, and that forced her to make a decision to leave. And the story goes that she went to the bus station, took out all the money that she had, threw it on the counter, and said, "How far will this take me?" And he told her it would take her to Hartford, Connecticut. And her response was, "That's where we're going." And the bus guy said, "Well, do you know anybody there?" And she said, "No, but we're leaving here." And her and her kids left, and they ended up going to Hartford, Connecticut. So it was a time of extreme violence. Yeah. And even the fellow who helped them with the sharecropper agreement, who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau, he describes it was so violent he barely escaped with his life, as he had to leave the South also. Mm-hmm. Those are the 3 books. It's again a portrayal of what I call the WhileBlack experience. The other thing that people don't realize is that the police force was founded as slave catchers. Their sole purpose in life was to catch runaway slaves. So when we talk about slavery and the police and that kind of thing, there's some history there that kind of explains maybe some of the actions that the police have taken across America with African Americans. I tell people all the time that the death of George Floyd, for example, if that hadn't been recorded, it would probably have gone down as a resisting arrest death. But because it was recorded, because of the technology, it didn't go down that way.
We hear about CRT, and some people don't know what that is. They think they're teaching it in elementary school, and they shouldn't, because then we're going to hate ourselves as white people. I mean, I'm so far removed from this. What's your take on CRT?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, it's not going to be taught in elementary school.
Of course not. No.
Of course not, but it was, the background. It's a college level law school kind of thing to basically reflect some of the stories that I write about, reflect how policies affect race. And until we come to deal with that and recognize that it's a reality, the time for healing could have been Reconstruction. It was successful.
Mm-hmm.
I tell people all the time, in my opinion, African Americans are some of the best citizens in this country. We've been fighting to have votes for years.
Yeah.
And every year it's the same thing. But we don't riot in the streets. We follow the laws. We try to, and we try to be good citizens. We participated in every war.
Yeah.
I mean, we've done, I think, what we could do to model the right citizenship in America. But the CRT is just, I mean, it's just something else, another boogeyman to chase.
Exactly.
That's all.
So, in your opinion, people who criticize it, and they don't know what they're talking about. They think that they're against it.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask them what it means, most of them don't know.
Exactly.
They make up something because they saw it on the news, on some news channel that they follow. But they don't know what it means.
Yeah, I don't know how you're going to reach those kind of people, but anyway.
Well, I'm not sure either. There's some people you can reach. There's some people that you'll never reach. So I'm looking for the person that is just looking to expand their knowledge about why things happen, or maybe is on a fence and doesn't understand. I mean, if you look at the police, I go back to that example. We have been complaining about the police for centuries. And the only reason that it came to fruition is because of the technology associated with cell phones and videos. Otherwise, I think we'd still be complaining and people would still be saying, well, you're ignoring it because my son never gets arrested. So your son must be violent. That's kind of the fallback position for a lot of people. Yeah. So I hope to tell the story about being WhileBlack in a manner in which it's not threatening. There are good stories. The people are realistic in my stories. They're smart. They're family orientated, and they're not afraid to make decisions and move forward to protect themselves.
I really like that term, WhileBlack.
Yeah,
that makes total sense. You get a whole series out of that. Yeah.
It's very appropriate. I mean, I can talk about, and within my community, we know this, WhileBlack while driving, WhileBlack while shopping, WhileBlack while walking down the street. We read about it today. Yeah. Some guy's delivering goods and somebody decides to shoot at his truck. I mean, those are the kind of that's the reality of what we face WhileBlack in this country. And I'm hoping that I don't think anybody else is writing the kind of books that I'm writing, not as a new author anyway. Right. So I think they're good stories, and hopefully we'll give people a different perspective of the WhileBlack experience in this country. So the next time somebody says something, maybe they'll stick up and say, that's not right.
Exactly. Well, you're very well spoken. Your description of your book didn't give away anything that makes me not want to read it. It makes me want to read it. Have you considered doing any public speaking, readings from your books, that sort of thing?
I have, but it's like I told you earlier, I'm the CEO, I'm the marketing, I'm the creative writer, and all those kind of things. So I haven't done as much as I'd like to do when it comes to publicizing my book. I've done, I look at podcasts. I've actually contacted a couple of African American museums and donated a book to them just so they could look at it.
Mhm.
I'm doing some there's some websites that I'm working with, and I do the old fashioned thing. I've got business cards. So when I'm out and about, sometimes I'll just leave them somewhere. Sometimes somebody will ask, "Well, what do you do?" And I just give them my card
There you go.
and say, "Well, I write books."
There you
Not
go.
many people have met authors, so I said I published 3 books. Want to check it out? And I have my own website
Yes.
that describes. I call it the WhileBlack Library, and it describes the 3 books and the three eras that I go after. The pre-Civil War, the Reconstruction era, and the early eras of segregation. Another thing that I discovered in my writing on the if New Orleans could talk, there was a cemetery in New Orleans, McGonough Cemetery. McGonough was a plantation owner, had a lot of land, etc. Well, it was a cemetery that they buried black slaves and free black people in. And then for some reason, a free slave got involved, and they started burying white people in there also. Well, you'll love this. The mayor of New Orleans during the early years of segregation said that was unacceptable, and he actually dug up the bodies, the white bodies, and moved them to a different cemetery. So that's part of the history that people need to understand, at the depth to which people would go to support segregation during the early years of segregation. I was kind of floored by
That's wild. That's just wild.
that particular statistic.
Do you see anything hopeful around you currently? I know we've got a lot of problems, hear all kinds of nonsense in the news, but do you see any good things?
Yeah,
I do.
I do. I think the issue is the the minority makes all the noise. So if you're not careful, you tend to think that everybody thinks like that. But the reality is that the majority will rule in this country, and you have to believe that. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble
Mm.
if you don't believe that. But I think the majority believe that, like the idea of having a diverse country where everybody has equal access to resources, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
And that's how the country will flourish.
sure.
Another example, not to take up too much of your time, another example is there was a movie that came out called Hidden Figures. It was about the Apollo, uh, the initial Apollo sending a man into space. It's amazing to me that no one ever talked about the black mathematician who was a genius at math and helped them put together the right trajectories using math formulas, etc., until this movie came out. And I'm thinking to myself, Johnson, why didn't I learn about that when I was in school, about the Apollo, about all of these women in Alabama, I believe it was Huntsville, who were working with Apollos and NASA to get these people up in space? You would think we had no part in that, but
Wow.
we had a strong part in that. So those are the kinds of things that's why I write historical fiction. I want people to recognize that our people are more than just Martin Luther King and the people that you typically see in front of us. We have a lot of heroes and heroines in our group, and I want to give them some visibility through my writings.
Okay. One final question.
Mm-hmm.
You chose historical fiction. You could
Mm-hmm.
have just as easily written nonfiction and just been telling the history of the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
from everything, the research that you found, and put it into your own words. Why did you choose fiction?
I chose fiction because I think of myself as being creative. And I thought that fiction allows me to use my imagination. I have an ability to create scenarios in my head that I can play out and write about. So I thought that it would be good for me to project a different image of African American history through fiction. And my characters reflect the African American persona. And I didn't think I could do that just writing nonfiction because it's detail driven. I'm not a detail person, as my girlfriend always reminds me. But I like the idea of of using my imagination to put together characters that people will remember. People will remember Sambo from my first book, only because of the name and because of the final confrontation with Big Dan Connor.
Yeah.
People will remember the gangsters in If the Elders Call. One of the gangsters is called the Commander. He was the leader of the gangsters. People will remember him. People remember Betty Jones, the brothel madam, because she ran the biggest brothel madam and she had blue eyes. So that was interesting. So I like doing that kind of thing versus just to me it's exciting to write that kind of stories.
Alvin, I wish you well in the future. And when you write your next book, contact me. We'll talk some more.
You'll be the first one I contact.
All right.
Thank you,
Take
John.
care of yourself, sir.
Have a good day. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's our show for today. If you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then please hit the like button and subscribe. And don't forget to ring that bell for future notifications. And if you are a self-published author, I would really like to speak with you. Until such time, keep on writing and be kind to one another.